Hi everyone, my name is Kent. I write articles about marketing and psychology and human behavior at kenthendricks.com. If you're interested in this kind of thing, I encourage you to check it out. Today we're talking about the peak end rule. The peak end rule, here's what it is. It predicts that your memory of an experience strongly correlates with the average of how you feel at the peak and at the end of that experience. So to start our thinking off about this, I'll ask a question. Have you ever thought about how strange it is that the moment you're experiencing right now will never happen again? It's gone. The only thing you can take with you into the future are your memories, and your memories are mostly influenced by your feelings. You've probably heard the phrase that that people don't remember what you say, they just remember how you make them feel, and that kind of gets at that idea. So it's really feelings. It's less the content of the present moment you're having. It's less the content of the experience, and it's how you're feeling about it. That's what you take from now, from the present into the future. And what's really crazy and a little scary is that most of those feelings don't last either. So that begs a question, which is, how do you remember anything? If you don't really remember the content and you forget all the feelings, how do you know you even had an experience to begin with? So what I want to do is look at some of the strange ways your brain uses the few feelings you keep to reconstruct your complete memory of an experience. And specifically, we're going to look at two feelings, feelings that occur at two specific moments, the peak and the end. So what's the peak? Well, the peak is the best moment of a pleasurable experience, or it's the worst moment of a painful experience. And the end is what it is. It's the end. It's what you feel when the experience finishes. And your brain relies on these two moments, the peak and the end, and it uses the peak and the end as a proxy for how it thought you felt for the rest of the time, which it now forgot. This is what becomes the basis for your memory. Your brain does this in a really predictable and really reliable and a little bit scary, a really measurable way. That's what's called the peak end rule. There are three reasons why the peak end rule is really important to understand. First, it matters because it reveals a really interesting and systematic way that you misremember. So it's not enough that you just get things wrong and forget things, but it's that you get them wrong and forget things in a very predictable, systematic way. So we're going to look at that in some detail, including a whole bunch of examples that show how it works and a few examples that explain when and why it doesn't work. The second reason the peak end rule is so important is because other people know about it. And you're under the influence all the time of people who are in the position of crafting experiences for you. This could be as simple as the enjoyable experience you have when you eat out at a restaurant. Could be the experience you have of being manipulated by marketers when you view an advertisement or click on something. It could be the pain you experience when you're about to have a medical procedure done. In fact, it's painful experiences, medical procedures, is where the peak end rule is first discovered. So we want to know what others understand and know about the peak and the end so that we know when we're being influenced by the peak end rule. That's the second reason. The third reason the peak end rule is so important to understand is because it exposes a really important gulf between our experiencing self and our remembering self. The person you are when you're having an experience and the person you are while you're remembering that experience. And if it sounds a little weird to talk about yourself having multiple selves, think about it this way. You do have you have more than one self that doesn't agree with itself, if you will. Maybe it's the self that doesn't want to eat dessert and the self that wants to eat dessert, right? We have these sort of internal, one on each shoulder battles. Those are multiple selves in a sense that are influencing who we are. So we're going to explore the experiencing self that's having the experience, and then the remembering self who's maybe reflecting and making future decisions and actions based on that experience, two selves. So those are the three reasons the peak end rule is so important to understand. But first, what we need to do is take a step back and define what we mean by the present, by now. And it sounds like that should be really straightforward and easy to define, and at some level it is, but at a couple of other levels it's really not. So we're going to start there just to make sure we're understanding what we mean by the present. The present, as you experience it, is not a moment in time. It's actually 3 seconds long. That's how long now is when you perceive it. Why 3 seconds? Well, something strange happens at the 3-second mark for all people from all cultures. There's all kinds of examples of human behavior that have some sort of weird, defining window at 3 seconds. That's like a demarcator of human behavior. People recite poetry in a rhythm of 3 seconds on average, regardless of the language. Infant hand gestures take place in 3-second groups. So if you've got a baby at home, you can look at them. Adults do the same thing when they use hand gestures, like what I'm doing in this video. And when you wave goodbye, the average wave is 3 seconds long. When you shake someone's hand, it's 3 seconds long. When you hug someone, that's 3 seconds long. In fact, there's all these studies of Olympic athletes who are winning and hugging each other, and 3 seconds is just sort of the average across all cultures. It takes about 3 seconds to divert your attention from one thing to another. And the 3-second mark just really acts as this boundary of human behavior where something stops and starts. So, at some level you could object that, I'm just cherry picking here. And that's fair, right? There's thousands of things that people do, and I'm just picking the ones that last 3 seconds long, and that's a fair criticism. But there's really more going on. Neuroscientists and those who study the brain, they found that at a window right after 2.5 seconds, that's where your brain stops grouping sets of stimuli as one coherent unit. And then by about 5 seconds, it perceives them as completely separate. So there's lots of studies on this. That's a little bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about now. But for now, just know that after 3 seconds, things just break up into multiple units. And the present, as we perceive it, as our brain processes it, acts as kind of this 3-second moving average going through time. That is the present. And when you string a bunch of these presents together, what you have is an experience. So think about your commute to work, or the last movie you saw, or the last conversation you had with a friend or a coworker, or the last meal you ate at a restaurant, where you're stringing all these sort of units of now into a bracketed moment combination thing, and that's what we're calling an experience. But there's a problem with that, and that is that the experiences you have are made up of more moments than you can remember. So if you do a little math here, the present is 3 seconds long, then that means a minute-long experience contains 20 moments. An hour-long experience contains 1,200 moments. If you go on a week-long vacation, then you have more than 100,000 moments of now. So, it's conceivable that you might remember your 20-minute commute, but you are just not going to remember the 400 instances of now that you experienced as you drove. Most of those moments you're just going to forget. And so the question is, with so many vanishing memories and moments, how do we know that the memories about our experiences are accurate? And, one answer might be that you just recall the sum of all the moments you have. So I'm going to show a graph here. That's the area shaded under the graph. It's the sum of your experience as the way you remember it. But if you think about it, there's a problem with that. For your brain to calculate the sum of your experience, it would still need to have all those moments stored away somewhere in your subconscious. And it's true that you do store things in your subconscious that you're not always aware of, but the idea that your brain can take this running cumulative total that's happening and keep track of all that, ready for a quick calculation, it just doesn't work. So another thought is that maybe instead of remembering an experience based on the sum of its moments, you remember based on the average of all the moments. And I'm going to show a graph now that gives you the average of a hypothetical experience. But same problem, we have the same problem here. We've already stated that you can't remember every single moment of an experience. And since you can't calculate your average feeling if you don't know how you felt in each moment, we can safely say it's also not the average that produces a memory. And there's some research that backs this up, but for now you're going to have to take me at my word. Okay, so if your brain doesn't reconstruct an experience based on the sum, and it doesn't reconstruct your memory of an experience based on the average of the combined moments, then how does it do it? In other words, if you can't remember everything, how do you remember anything? How does your brain know what to remember? And here's how. Like I said at the beginning, your brain samples just a couple of key moments from an experience. The first moment is the peak. It's the moment of greatest pleasure or the worst pain, the most intense drama, the most boredom, whatever experience you're having, the most, whatever that is the peak. And then the second is the end, which is how you feel at the final moments of your experience. Your brain uses those two sampled moments, the peak and the end, to guess at how you felt for the rest of the moments. It doesn't know how you felt. It's making a guess based on the peak and the end. And then finally, using a kind of backwards looking inductive inference, your brain constructs a global retrospective evaluation of your whole experience. So this process of sampling the peak moment and the end moment of an experience and then using it as a proxy to guess at the rest of the experience, that's what we mean, like I said at the beginning, what we mean by the peak end rule. So here's the definition of the peak end rule. The peak end rule predicts that your memory of an experience strongly correlates with the average of how you feel at the peak and at the end of the experience. So the equation is peak plus end divided by 2. A quick caveat, that's not exactly your memory, but it's pretty close. So most of the research and a lot of the articles we're going to talk about here in a few minutes, they get about 70 to 90% reliability. So the correlation isn't complete. It's not 100%, but it's usually 70 to 90. Few exceptions to that, but an 80 is probably a good number to have in mind when we talk about the peak end rule. So let's talk about a few examples of how this works. The first example, the one that basically where they discovered the peak end rule, was actually a study of people who were getting colonoscopies. They recorded, doctors and these psychologists, they recorded how much pain people felt while they were getting their procedure, which when the study was done, was a lot more painful then than it is now. So, think late 80s, 90s kind of thing. 154 patients, they were asked to indicate on a scale of 0 to 10 how much pain they were experiencing each minute of their colonoscopy. Colonoscopy finishes, and then 1 hour after the colonoscopy, the researchers came back to the people and they asked them how much pain they remembered feeling. So during the colonoscopy, and then an hour later, and then they followed up a third time a month later, and they asked the patients then to recall how painful their experience was. So real time, 1 hour later, 1 month later. And here's what the psychologists found. Psychologists could predict how much pain people remembered by averaging the peak pain and the end pain. What's incredible, though, is they could disregard all the other pain the patients experienced. So that's the first thing they found, which we've kind of touched on. The second thing they found, which we've also talked about a little bit already, they found no correlation between the average pain or the total pain, or, and this is kind of surprising, they didn't find any correlation between the duration of the experience and the remembered pain. So how long the procedure lasts did not affect how painful people remembered the overall experience being. So to put it another way, a 4-minute colonoscopy and a 67-minute colonoscopy, which were the two endpoints, with an identical peak and an identical end, would be remembered as equally painful. So the guy sitting on the table for an hour and the guy sitting on the table for 4 minutes will, an hour later or a month later, remember it as being experiencing the same amount of pain. So that's the second thing they found. The third thing that psychologists found when they were studying these patients is that because the duration of the experience didn't matter, long colonoscopies could sometimes be remembered as less painful than short colonoscopies. And here's how. So when doctors extended the colonoscopy for just a few minutes, so it just kind of arbitrarily left it going for a little while, but then they made those extra few minutes a little less painful, that dropped the end pain down, and the patients remembered the entire colonoscopies as being less painful overall. Even though they were on the table for longer, they were having a longer colonoscopy, and the total pain they were experiencing real time was greater. So colonoscopies, peak end rule, first example. So they followed up with this experiment with another one that was a little bit similar. They asked people to plunge their hand in ice cold water. They had 32 people participate. The water was 14.1 Celsius, so this isn't enough to freeze your hand or cause any kind of lasting damage, but it's pretty uncomfortable. And as with a colonoscopy experiment, the psychologists did the same thing. They measured the discomfort in real time, so everybody put their hand in the cold water, and I think there was a little dial they had that they measured it. But they had to do it twice, okay? So the first time they put their hand in the cold water for 60 seconds. Second time, they put their hand in the cold water for 90 seconds. But the catch was, during the final 30 seconds, the researchers raised the temperature of the water from 14.1 degrees Celsius to a little bit warmer temperature, a 15.2 Celsius. So just a little over a degree. Not a lot. I mean, really tough to perceive the difference. Again, as with a colonoscopy experiment, the researchers found that 22 of the 32 people preferred the longer trial, even though the longer trial actually contained all the pain of the short trial and then some. And what this tells us is that the memory of an episode, largely determined by the peak-end rule again, it predicts people's future behavior more than the actual real-time experience of that episode. So not only do your remembered feelings not match your experienced feelings, but it's actually your remembered feelings that predict your future behavior. So if you ask somebody, hey, how was your colonoscopy, or how was that ice water, hand plunge thing you did? They're not just gonna remember experiencing a certain degree of pain or another degree of pain, but they're actually going to act differently because of this misremembering that's happening. So it's important. So there's basically 3 interesting ways that people got it wrong. First, people claim that the long trial was more comfortable, and this contradicts the real-time experience. Second thing, they said that the long trial was not as cold at the most extreme moment. But that's not true either, because both were exactly 14.1 Celsius at their most extreme. I'm going to throw a graph up here again where you can see the 2 graphs there. The one with a straight line, it's equal temperature, and then the 90-second one, you can see the graph goes up a little bit. But the people who did the long trial said that it wasn't as cold at the most extreme moment when it actually was. That's the second thing. The third thing that they found is that the better ending of the long trial convinced, get this, 18.75% of the participants that the long trial was actually shorter. So the people who had their hand in the bucket for 90 seconds thought it was less than 60 seconds long because it ended more comfortably at the end, which the better ending combined with the same peak changed the average memory, which essentially made them warp their memory of the time. So the peak-end rule is a way to warp your time, your memory of time. Okay, so we talked about colonoscopies, we talked about ice water, now we're going to talk about studying, another example of the peak-end rule. And this has some real impact on education, teachers, students, learning. Educators have used the peak-end rule to help their students learn more by altering their study habits. So students are more likely to study if they've had a good experience the last time they studied, right? That makes sense. So if you have a favorable memory of a past study session, you're probably going to study again. Compared, to the students who really hate studying, don't like it, they're going to be less likely to study again later, and that obviously has an effect on their grades and whether they like school and learning and things like that. So there was a psychologist, and she studies learning and memory, and she found that English-speaking students liked learning long lists of Spanish words more than short lists. But this only worked when the long lists ended with a few less challenging words. So she did this experiment, and her experiment showed that while people got a better grade after studying the short list, they actually preferred to study the long list. So 70% of students thought that the long list was easier, even though it was not only harder, but it also caused them to perform worse on the test, which is kind of interesting. So the better ending, averaged with the same peak, produced a better memory, even though the overall real-time experience and the grades were worse. So again, the peak-end rule changes people's perspective of studying, makes them more likely to study more, helps them do better. But you could ask, well, wouldn't a worse score on a test discourage students from studying more? But according to some other research that Finn, this is the psychologist, her name was, that Finn and her colleagues did, the desire to study doesn't come from test performance, but from the remembered enjoyment of a previous study session. So you can get a bad grade and still want to study again if you like the last time you study. So that's why a longer study session with a better ending will encourage future learning, even if it doesn't actually produce higher grades in the short term. So that's another interesting application of the peak-end rule in education. So the fourth example we're going to talk about, fourth and last example of the peak-end, and then we're going to talk about some other things. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about user interface design. This is something we experience every time we open our computers or pull out our phones, surf the internet, install software. That's user interface design, when we are interacting with the interface that designers have put in front of us. And the peak-end rule can predict how people interact with design elements on your website or the software you design, and it predicts how they're going to feel about it when they do that. So same with colonoscopies, ice bucket plunges, and studying. When people interact with the interfaces you design, they're doing so in time. I think it's interesting that designers spend a lot of time thinking about the second and third dimensions in design, but I think the fourth dimension is just as important, and that's where the peak end rule matters. So, like all experiences in time, the interactions people have with the software or the websites you design, they contain peaks and ends too, because those constitute really important moments that can predict how people will remember their experience with your website, with your software, with your app, with your brand. So it's really important. Probably the most one of the most important places where this matters is the checkout experience, where people have in a way decided to buy, or they kind of want to know what it feels like to buy, and what you put in the checkout on your website or an e-commerce store that you might have really can impact how they feel during the checkout experience and how they feel at the end of that experience when they click that buy button, hopefully. So researchers have tested this. They've discovered that the peak end rule applies to user interface design by creating a mock online form. So think about forms you've encountered online. You type in a few fields, you hit next, you type in some stuff, you click some buttons, your address, your name, whatever. Multiple pages, and then you get to the end. So what these researchers did is they basically created a fake form, multiple pages, but each page had different amount of sliders and buttons. Some of them had a lot of sliders to work through. Some of them had just a few. Some of the sliders were, big and easy to work with. Some of them were small and more difficult to move. So I'm going to show you a picture here of just a sample page from this study to give you a feel for what these people were kind of dealing with. You can see the sliders there, and then you hit next and go to the next page. Okay, so people worked through these pages of sliders and got done. And researchers asked them how much they enjoyed the experience. So, not surprisingly, people preferred series that had a positive peak early on, followed by an improving trend at the end. So they preferred a series like 72763. They preferred that more than they liked 38446, because with that first series, you can see the peak is early and then it gets nice and easy by the end. Whereas with that second series, 38446, yeah, there's still a peak that's early, but it gets kind of worse at the end. So that's just an example of the kinds of pages people would like. So peak end rule really applies to interface design like this too. So anytime your users or people who hit your website are experiencing it through time in some sort of designed way, it's really important to keep in mind where their peaks are occurring and where their ends are occurring, because that will impact how they remember their interaction with your brand. I got one more example. It's a quick one. It's advertising. You probably know this, but people respond better to ads with positive peaks and ends too. So this has not been studied too much in any kind of public way. A lot of agencies and marketing departments and designers have data on the ads they design, but there's not a lot of universally shared data. Fortunately, there's been a few studies on this. So researchers would ask people to view 30-second ads and then provide kind of real-time ratings as they're watching them. So how do you feel while you're watching it? Do you like what you're seeing? Is it funny? Is it sad? And they found correlations between how much people like the ad at the peak and the end and how much they like the ad after watching it. But they also discovered something else interesting about how peaks and ends affect viewers' later memory. And this is a kind of a segue into what we're going to talk about next. But the researchers found that viewers were more likely to remember the ad positively when the peak appeared early rather than late. So where's the peak happening? It's not just enough that there is a peak, but where is it? And they also found that as more time elapsed after the peak, the people like the ad less. So that kind of goes hand in hand. So that hints at something interesting about peaks and ends. You can have two experiences with identical peaks and ends, but you might remember the experiences a little differently depending on several specific features of those peaks and ends. Where are they occurring? How long are they? How many of them? Those kinds of things. So we're going to explore that next. And specifically, we're going to look at 8 factors, 8 of them, that determine how peaks and ends influence your memory. So we're going to get at those questions about where peaks and ends are occurring and what they're doing in a sequence of moments that constitutes an experience. I said there's 8 factors. There's probably a lot more. It's just that, in my opinion, there's only 8 where there's kind of a substantive, reproducible body of research. There's probably a few more, but I don't personally feel like there's a big enough sample size to make a definitive sort of statement about how it actually works. So I'm just going to look at 8, but just note that there might be a few more too. So first factor we're going to dive in is what we just talked about. It's the recency of the peak. And the question here is, does the recency of the peak affect how much the peak influences your memory of an experience? And yes, it does, but only a little bit. So one of the best studies on this was done by Charles Schreiber and Daniel Kahneman. They did this when Kahneman was at Berkeley. They had all these people listen to a series of really annoying sounds from 60 to 80 decibels. So that's not loud enough to like damage your hearing. It's not like you're standing next to a jet engine, but think like a loud truck that drove by, when the UPS truck drives by, or something like that, where it's just a little bit annoying. And they had people rate how they were feeling about these sounds as they were listening to them. So again, it's a real-time reporting. And when they compared the real-time ratings to the overall remembered rankings, they found, interesting, that the recency of the peak did matter, but it only mattered a little bit. And for a negative experience, like hearing a loud sound for an extended period, they would have a little bit better memory when the peak occurred early. So in general, first thing, all things being equal, a more recent peak has more impact on memory than an early peak, but only a little bit. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing that matters is the number of peaks. Okay, you can look at this graph here. What if there are 2 equal peaks? Does the peak end effect get stronger? Do they stack? Do they, if there's 3, is it additive or is it multiplicative? What does that look like? So in the same study of annoying sounds, Schreiber and Kahneman, they had some students hear the sound at its loudest only once, but then for other students, they would have them hear it twice. So 2 equally negative peak experience. And then they again compared these real-time rankings based on the memory of the experience. And they learned that a second peak did not change the overall memory of the experience. So if you have 2 equally bad peaks, you're going to still remember the experience as if you had only 1 bad peak. Same with the positive experience. If you have 1 really good peak or 2 really good peaks, a day or a week later, your memory is going to be identical as if you'd only had 1 really good peak. So your brain doesn't stack peaks together. Okay, the third thing that matters is the duration of the peak, or the third question we have is about the duration. So you can see the graph here. You can see there's that graph with the peak where it hits the peak and then it kind of holds for a while. So the question is, do peaks that last a long time have more effect than peaks that are instant or short or spontaneous or instantaneous? And they found again in this study that when the most annoying sound lasted longer, it did produce a slightly more negative memory for the entire experience. Well, at first glance, this seems to contradict the earlier claim that I said where duration doesn't matter. Remember the colonoscopy? The guy with the 4-minute colonoscopy and the 67-minute colonoscopy could have the same remembered discomfort as long as the peak and end were about the same. I did say that. Duration doesn't matter, but it does matter a little bit when the duration of the peak is what's being combined with the end. So, yeah, duration of the experience doesn't matter very much, although it actually does. We're going to come back to that in a second. But for now, the duration of the experience doesn't matter, but the duration of the peak does matter a little bit. A long peak has slightly more influence over your memory than a short peak does. Next, we're going to talk about the trend of the experience. And this is taking a little bit of a step back. We're not really talking about the average here, but we're talking about how things are kind of going overall, generally. Is it getting better or is it worse? And this does affect how peaks and ends factor into your overall memory. So in a 1992 experiment, the psychologists Carol Very and Daniel Kahneman, they compared how people responded to experiences with the same peaks and ends, but in one version, the overall trend was getting worse, while in the other version, the overall trend was getting better. And they found that people gave the worsening trend a 13% lower rating than its opposite. So same peak, same end, but here the trend changed the memory by around 13%. So not a lot, but still something, right? They found, though, that this happened even more when the trend line was steeper. So if the series went from a little bit bad to a little bit good, that'd be kind of not too steep. But if it went from really bad to really good, that had a bigger impact. on how things were remembered. But there's a little bit of a caveat here, and that is that when the experience is pleasurable and the trend is improving, people want the experience to be short. So apparently we like steep trend lines. But on the other hand, when the experience is painful and the trend is getting worse, people want the experience to be long. So we would prefer to have a positive experience with a steep trend line and a negative experience with a kind of a shallow trend line. I don't know why that is. And I don't know a lot about how that factors into peaks and ends necessarily, but that just seems to be, in general, how we approach experiences. So the idea of kind of ripping off a Band-Aid and getting it done quickly, we don't really operate that way on negative experiences. We only operate that way on positive experiences. Again, on average. Lots of exceptions, and I think the research here could use a little bit more experimentation, but that seems to be where things are. Okay, the fifth factor that affects peak ends, how peaks and ends factor into memory, is the rate of change. So whether you get to the peak really quickly or really slowly affects how the peak affects your overall memory, okay? So in a 1998 study, Dan Ariely found that people remember an experience as more painful when the peak is reached very quickly. So I'm going to put a graph up. You can see one of them has kind of a slow ramp up to the peak, and one of them is a really fast one. The fast one, that peak becomes just a huge factor when it's being averaged with the end. It might not be a 50-50 average if the peak if you get to the peak really fast. Another study of advertising, I think it was the same study I mentioned earlier, it found that people liked TV commercials more when they had a really steep, quick ramp up to the peak rather than a slow, ramp up to a peak, 2/3 of the way through the commercial or something like that. Then there was a third piece of evidence from the same study of annoying sounds that I mentioned a few minutes ago. People would give an overall worse ranking when the volume went up really quick, when it got really annoying really fast compared to when it got annoying, same amount of annoying, but slower. So basically, all things being equal, a very quick ramp up to the peak causes the peak to be a greater factor in the memory of the experience overall when it combines with the end. All right, the sixth factor that affects how the peak and the end get integrated into your memory is the trend right at the end. So we've already seen that an improving trend produces a better memory than a worsening trend. But it turns out that the trend right at the end also affects how much the end gets factored into your memory when it combines with the peak. Basically, when the trend is improving at or near the end, people remember an experience more positively overall. So in a 1991 study, Carol Very and Daniel Kahneman, I've mentioned them before, they asked people to rank several painful sequences, and they found that a pain rating of 5 is remembered as less painful if the ending trend is improving compared to that same rating when the ending trend is worsening. So for example, a 2-5-8 sequence might have been rated as 64 on a scale of 0 to 100, but a 2-5-8-4 sequence was rated a 53. Another one, an 8-7-6-5-4-3-2 sequence was rated a 46.4, while an 8-7-6-5-4 sequence was rated a 53.9. Basically, when the pain was worsening at the end of the experience, people remembered it as more painful, but when the pain was getting better at the end of the experience, people remembered it as less painful, even though they might have experienced more total pain overall. So one way of thinking about this, let's compare two hypothetical days. First hypothetical day, you drive your car to work, you park your car, you get out, and you hear a loud scraping noise, and when you turn around, you see that one of your coworkers has just hit your car as they pulled into the spot next to yours. So you're going to have to spend, get this, $175 to get it fixed. Not a good start to your day. Okay, that's your first hypothetical day. Now imagine your second hypothetical day. Same scenario. Your coworker hits your car just like before, but this time it's even worse. It's going to cost you $200 to fix it instead of $175. Fortunately, a few minutes later, you get inside, you notice your boss has placed a $25 Starbucks card on your desk as a thank you for landing a new client. So which scenario is worse? Well, most people would say the first one, where your coworker hits your car. But that doesn't make sense because both scenarios are economically equivalent. In the span of just a few minutes, you're out $175 in total. But the reason the second scenario feels better is because it represents a greatly improving trend at the end. In another study, researchers gave people another set of hypothetical scenarios. So I'll put them there on the screen for you. Scenario A, first you lose $85, then you win 80, you lose 5 overall. Scenario B, you just lose $5. Scenario C, first you lose 15, then you win 85, you get 70. Scenario D, first you win 85, then you lose 15, you still end up with 70. So as you can see here, A and B are economically the same. In both cases, you lose $5. And C and D are also economically the same. You win 70 in both cases. Yet 73% of the people who took this survey, they preferred the scenarios that were on the positive trajectory, while only 14% preferred scenarios that began positively and ended badly, even though both scenarios were economically equivalent. Trends matter in user experience design too. So if you think about the last time you tried to open a web page on a phone with a poor signal, the bar fills in from left to right slowly, you're just kind of waiting there. That's a progress bar. Researchers have found that people like progress bars that accelerate more quickly toward the end than progress bars that move at a constant rate. So in a study, people compared 445 sets of progress bars, so 990 progress bars total. This is pretty big. It took 5.5 seconds for all progress bars to fill in. So they all loaded at the exact same rate. There wasn't any kind of time variation in all 990 bars. They were all the same. But people thought that progress bars loaded more slowly when they started fast and then slowed down at the end. And they thought progress bars loaded more quickly when they started slow and then they sped up. So in another example of a time warp, kind of like the ones we've mentioned before, people perceived progress bars that sped up toward the end as taking quite a bit less than the 5.5 seconds to load in this particular study. So here's an image from the study. You can see kind of how the lines, are stacking across the screen there. But yeah, look at the bar there on the bottom that just has a steep ramp up near the end. That's the one that felt a lot faster than 5.5 seconds. Bottom line is that a well-designed progress bar with an improving ending trend actually warps your user's experience of time, and it makes them think it loads faster than it really does. It's a net win for you. So the summary here, all things being equal, an improving trend at the end improves the memory of the experience overall. All right, the seventh factor, and how peaks and ends combine to affect your memory. This one is the relative duration. So I've said before already a couple times that duration doesn't matter. Long colonoscopies and short colonoscopies, same amount of discomfort in the end in your memory, okay? However, duration can sometimes make a little bit of a difference in your overall memory, but only when the experience has greater amounts of intensity. So let's talk about that. So first, let's establish how duration works in a zero intensity change experience. So in an experiment, people place their arm on a heating element heated to 45 degrees Celsius. So that's about 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's pretty uncomfortable, but it's not going to, burn you right away or anything like that. One group touched this heating element for 10 seconds, and another group touched it for 14 seconds. But both groups remembered feeling the same amount of pain, even though the group who touched it for 14 seconds experienced more pain overall. So that's an experience with a constant temperature. There's no peaks. Duration doesn't matter. Okay, same memory, 10 seconds, 14 seconds. Okay, now let's look at how duration works when the intensity changes. In a different experiment, people ranked their discomfort at 5-minute intervals. So they had a 15-minute series of discomfort levels of 2, 5, 8. That'd be ranked to 64. 35-minute series of discomfort levels would be a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That'd be ranked like a 68.2, so a little bit worse. I know it's a little bit abstract to be talking about this, but this is, I think, probably the only good experiment on this. In another version of that same experiment, researchers found that the 30-minute series of discomfort levels of 2, 2, 4, 4, 6, 6 was 2.8% worse than a 15-minute series of discomfort levels of 2, 4, 6. So 2, 2, 4, 4, 6, 6 is 2.8% worse than 2, 4, 6. Basically, in this experiment, doubling the length of the experienced pain increased the remembered pain by 3.5%. So earlier I said duration doesn't matter, and generally duration doesn't matter. But there are some cases where duration might matter just a little bit. 3.5% isn't very much. It's one experiment, so it's hard to conclude that it really does matter very much. But evidence seems to point that it's not. The relevance is not zero. It's a little bit greater than that. All right, so let's look at the eighth factor that affects how peaks and ends integrate into memory formation. And this has to do not with peaks or ends, but actually it has to do with beginnings. We haven't talked about beginnings yet, but the specific question here is, all things being equal, how does adding a better beginning compare to adding a better ending? We've already seen that adding a better ending raises the average of the peak and the end and produces a better memory. But what happens when you take that same better ending and just move it over to a beginning? So I'm going to show a graph here where you can see that, and that kind of gives away the answer too. So sometimes the ending doesn't matter at all, right? In 2016, just a couple years ago, Stephanie Tolley from Stanford and Tom Mavis from NYU, they took a great experience that was at the end and they slotted it in the middle. So in one experiment they watched, I like these experiments, they had 750 run a fun run style obstacle course, something like the 5K with the colors exploding everywhere and obstacles in the way. And then after the race, Tolley and Mavis asked people how much fun they had on a scale of 1 to 10. And they also asked people how much they liked or didn't like each obstacle on a scale of 1 to 5. So, as predicted by the peak end rule, the obstacle at the end was a predictor of how people felt about the race as a whole. But here was the surprise. So did many of the other obstacles. So they basically looked at the end and they could make a prediction about how people felt. But they could also make that same prediction based on any of the other obstacles that weren't at the end. So in this race, the ending still mattered, but it just didn't matter more than any other moment. So let's pause for a second. Does that refute the peak end rule? Does that kind of undo everything I just said? Well, sort of, but bear with me a second. They did another experiment, and they found that the great experience at the end, when it's moved to the beginning, can also produce the same overall memory. So what they did is they had people read a series of cartoons and rate how funny they were. And then they asked people whether they would, hypothetically, be willing to pay $1 for more cartoons similar to the one they just read. And yeah, this was a hypothetical experience, so who knows what people would really do, but it seems to all point in the same direction. They found that people rated bad cartoons as worse than good cartoons, which that's not a surprise. They also found that bad cartoons decreased the overall enjoyment of the series when they were placed last. No surprise there either. That's the end in the peak end effect at work. But something else is going on here. They also found that bad cartoons decreased the overall enjoyment of the experience in an equal amount when they were placed first in the sequence. So, summary here is, better endings produce a positive memory, but sometimes so do better beginnings. So, in these two experiments that I just mentioned, the fun run and the cartoon experiment, the positive ending doesn't really matter. So what exactly is it about these two experiences that's, what's different about these two compared to all the others we have looked at so far that makes the peak end rule a poor predictor of memory? In other words, why does the peak end rule work for every experiment we've talked about except for these two? What is it about these two experiments where it doesn't work? And that's a good way to transition into the exceptions to the peak end rule. There are some cases where the peak end rule doesn't work. We're going to look at 4 of these because they all have something in common, or they have one of 4 things in common that explains why they don't work. So there's 4 kinds of experiences where the peak end rule just can't predict your memory very well. I'm going to list all 4 of them, and then we're going to talk about each of them in a little more detail. The first one is when you recall your experiences using semantic memory instead of episodic memory. And I'm going to explain what semantic memory and episodic memory are in just a second. So that's the first exception. The second kind of experience where the peak end rule doesn't work has to do with when you're performing a goal-oriented task or you're having an experience with a defined known ending. and I'll talk about that a little bit more. The third kind of experience that doesn't, where the peak-end rule can't predict your memory, is when you're doing something with a predefined sequence. And the fourth experience where the peak-end rule can't predict your memory is when you've made a strong prediction or you have an already established expectation about how that experience will go before you get into it. So it's not just the components of that experience that shape your memory. It's actually your presumptions, presuppositions, things you even assume about the experience before you've even started it that can affect your memory. And there's some really interesting stuff that happens there. We're going to talk about that in a second. But first, let's take a step back and look at each of these four in more detail. So the first one, again, to the first exception of the peak-end rule is the transition it's when your brain looks at semantic memory instead of episodic memory. Basically what's happening here is the peak-end rule fades with time. As time goes on, it just doesn't work as well. And some researchers have discovered this in a few experiments. So a few years ago in 2013, researchers, they wanted to understand how people remembered their vacations. So they tracked 72 people while they were on vacation, and then at the end of each day of vacation, people reflected how happy they were on a scale of 1, very unhappy, to 7, very happy. Then after the vacation was over, they were asked to give the same rating. So one group gave their overall ratings a day after, 3 weeks later, and 7 weeks later. Another group gave their ratings a day after, 7 weeks after, and 11 weeks after. So at 1 week after and 3 weeks after, the researchers, they could predict the experience using the peak-end rule. So the peak-end rule still worked 1 week later and 3 weeks later. But after that, at 7 weeks, something started to happen. The peak-end rule just became less reliable. They couldn't predict memory using the peak-end rule, and that just kept happening as more time passed, as the weeks kept going by. Basically, like all memories, peak memories and end memories fade over time, and they do so at a really predictable rate. And that's because at first your brain relies on what's called episodic memory, and that's memories from a specific episode. As time passes, your brain shifts from relying on episodic memory to relying on semantic memory, or semantic memory basically means it's inferences from generalizations about the kind of experience it is. So it's like a semantic category that encompasses that memory. So let's use an example. Let's say you go on a really scary roller coaster, and in the weeks following that ride, your memory is going to be informed by the peak and the end moment from that roller coaster ride. But months or years later, your memory is mostly going to be informed by what you know about scary roller coaster rides in general, and less by that specific ride you went on. It doesn't mean you're not going to remember that ride. It doesn't mean that the memories from that ride are going to have zero effect. It's just that as months go by, your mental category of what scary roller coasters are like is going to inform your memory of that ride more than the components of the experience of going on that ride itself. Because we know that because that experience would be shaped, or your memory of that experience would be shaped by the peak and end. As time passes, the peak and end just kind of fade away. Your brain stops thinking about that specific episode as much, and it shifts to thinking about the category of that kind of episode in general. So psychologists, people who study the brain, they've proposed one reason our brains accept this trade-off, and sometimes it's just, we need to learn something quickly and remember how we felt about it, and episodic memory is great at that. But we also need to have memories that are stable and that transcend episodes. And because it's these kinds of stable semantic memories that prepare us, equip us for new experiences. They allow us to make assumptions which are mostly correct about the world. Semantic memory does that really, really well. And plus, to learn new things, we also need to be able to forget others. So our brain's capacity is not infinite, and our memories are just not perfect. Let's look at some experiments here. One has to do with pregnancy and birth. Basically, women who have given birth to a second or third or fourth child, they show evidence of this transition from episodic to semantic memory. Here's why. Because they've already given birth once before, they have a more defined semantic category of giving birth. right? So let's go look at our roller coasters, right? If you've never been on a roller coaster, your semantic category of a roller coaster ride isn't quite as defined compared to had you been on 9 or 10 or 20 or 30 roller coasters. It's not that you don't have a semantic category, it's just not quite as informed by the experiences you've had. Giving birth is the same thing. And that means that women who have given birth before are quicker to transition from episodic memory of a specific labor and delivery experience to the semantic memory after they've had their second or third child. Whereas women who have given birth to only one child have a less defined semantic category of giving birth. That means that their episodic memory of that experience just lasts longer. There was this 2014 study that verified this. Researchers monitored 320 women from the beginning of labor to the birth of their child. And then after they'd given birth, the researchers asked the women to indicate how much pain they remembered feeling. Okay, so here's the results. 2 days after delivery, the Pecan rule predicted the amount of recalled pain. No surprise there. And they also predicted correctly that there was no correlation between the delivery duration and the amount of recalled pain, which is really crazy to think, but basically a 24-hour labor is remembered as no worse than a 3-hour labor. That's not me, that's what the women are reporting. So I'll just leave that there. Duration neglect. However, when researchers would follow up, they found something strange starting to happen at the 2-month mark. At 2 months, the Pecan rule predicted remembered pain, but only for mothers who had never given birth before. For mothers who had already had a child, the Pecan rule could not be used to predict their recalled pain. Basically, this confirms that the shift from episodic memory to semantic memory just takes longer for women who hadn't given birth before. For second and third time mothers who had already developed the semantic category for childbirth, their memory of their most recent childbirth could be more quickly transitioned from that episode's memory, from the episodic memory from that episode, to semantic memory, which is the memory category of childbirth as a whole. Okay, so that's the first exception to the Pecan rule, the passage of time, the transition from episodic to semantic memory. Second exception to Pecan rule, these are what I'm going to call goal-oriented experiences. The Pecan rule does not predict memory when the experience is goal-oriented. So here's a couple of examples of goal-oriented experiences. One would be standing in line, where you're having the experience with the single goal, you know how it's going to end, and that's going to end with you not being in line anymore. The goal is to get out of line. That's one. Second example of a goal-oriented experience is looking for something you've lost. So you've probably heard people say they find something, hey, that's the last place I looked, and I found it in the last place I looked, which makes complete sense. Why would you keep looking for the item after you found it? You would never hear somebody say, I found it in the second to last place I looked, right? When you lose something and you look for it, that's an experience with a very defined goal, and you know that you're going to stop looking when you find the object you're looking for. Okay, that's the kind of experience I'm talking about here. The reason the Pecan rule doesn't work for goal-oriented experiences is because the peak is the end. Peaks and ends collapse into this singular moment that occurs right when the experience ends. And it also doesn't work because you know it's coming. Typically, the Pecan rule works really well if you have some idea of what the experience is going to be like, but you don't really know the highs or the lows or what they're going to be like. But when you're looking for something, you already know what's going to happen. You're going into it with a very sort of defined, you know how it's going to be when you're in there, right? So let's go back to the act of waiting in line. There are some researchers who measured people's feelings while they're waiting in line on a scale of -10 to 10. So some people stood in short lines that moved slowly, while others stood in long lines and moved quickly. And the pace that people moved through the lines varied. Some accelerated, others slowed. But the catch was that in all the lines, everybody stood in line for the same amount of time, regardless of how fast or slow the lines moved, right? But people who stood in short lines indicated a peak of 5, while people who stood in long lines indicated a peak of 8.4. So on a scale of -10 to 10, that's a pretty broad spread. But the main thing here isn't that surprising. People hate standing in lines. So if you're in a line that feels short, you're going to be happier while you're in line. But what was surprising was that the feelings of peak annoyance while standing in line did not affect how people remembered their experience later. So only the feelings at reaching the end of the line mattered. and people's feelings at the end of the line were largely affected by only one factor, and that was how quickly the line moved. So for a goal-ending experience like standing in line, peaks just don't really matter that much in the memory of your experience. Doesn't mean the end doesn't matter, it's just that the peak end rule doesn't really work because there's no peak to factor in to your memory along with the end. So that's the second exception to the peak end rule. The third exception to the peak end rule are experiences with predefined sequences. This isn't too different from a goal-oriented experience in that you have expectations going into it. And the reason again is that these kind of predefined sequences just don't lack any kind of element of surprise. You know what to expect. You're less likely to rely on a peak moment or an end moment as a cue for remembering the experience as a whole because it's already a little bit defined for you. A lot of times these kind of predefined sequences are defined by cultural norms. So, take the way that we end conversations, for example. If you've ever seen The Simpsons, you're probably familiar with the character Apu who owns this gas station or convenience store. And every time a scene with him ends, he says, "Thank you, come again." It's just a ritualistic way that store clerks close conversations. But there's one scene where Homer Simpson, who's the main character, he has this altercation with Apu, and Apu kicks him out of the store. And then Homer leaves, but right when he's leaving, Apu tells him, "Mr. Simpson, get out of my store, please come again." And this phrase, "please come again," which, while technically positive, functions purely as a social convention, just like a phrase like "see you later," right? So the fact that "please come again" is this sort of positive phrase that would end that experience, we've defined that phrase to function in a certain kind of cultural, in alignment with certain cultural, socio-cultural norms that takes away the actual meaning of those words and replaces it with the norm we bring to it. So you can't consider the positive nature of that phrase to be any kind of factor in your memory because people just don't rely on them to form memories of their experience. Another place this happens is in service calls, like if you call up a company to get something resolved. In a study in Europe in 2004, researchers evaluated, I think, 97 calls. This was a large financial services provider. The calls lasted 208 seconds on average, and the researchers noticed that the peak end rule just didn't work when people were later asked how their calls went. And that's because there's an established social protocol for how these calls should end. And they're all supposed to end with, "Have a nice day," or "Thank you for your time." The peak could still sometimes be used to predict how the call was remembered, but the end just didn't matter because we all kind of know how they're supposed to end, and because we know that, the content of the ending is just kind of irrelevant. So that's the third exception, predefined sequences. Fourth exception to the peak end rule, experiences that have been predicted or that have strongly held expectations when you're going into them. And this is my favorite exception to the peak end rule. The bottom line is that sometimes your memory of an experience is affected more by your expectations going into the experience than the peaks and the ends from the experience itself. And this is because you see what you expect to see. There's this famous video of a man in a gorilla costume wandering through a game of basketball. You've probably heard of this. What's crazy is that roughly 1/3 and 1/2 of the people who watch this video, they don't see the gorilla. So there's these people passing a ball to each other. This guy in a gorilla suit comes through, he's wandering through, he's banging a chest, and he walks off screen. 1/3 to 1/2 of people don't even notice the gorilla is there, and that's because they have been asked to count how many times the players pass the ball. So they're focused on one thing. They go into this experiment looking for a thing, and everything else sort of falls by the wayside, and so they completely miss the gorilla. Just search for it on YouTube, you can find it. You approach experiences the same way. If you expect to have a good time, you probably will. If you expect not to have a good time, you won't. There was a study in 1994, Kristen Claren and her colleagues, they showed this film to two groups of people. Group one was told the film's going to be great. This is a great movie. Second group wasn't told anything. Which group liked it more? You can probably guess. It was the group who was told that they would enjoy the film. The expectations informed the memory. There was this other study where these students went biking for 3 weeks, which is a long time. And researchers asked them to indicate how they felt about the experience at 12 different intervals. Twice before the trip, 8 times during the trip, twice after the trip. The results indicated that people's memories of the trip were dictated more by their expectations going into the trip than by their actual experience while they were on the trip. So the authors of the study, they basically said, and here's a quote that I liked, they enjoyed the trip less than they anticipated and less than they remembered. And it was by quite a bit too. Before the trip, 5% of the bikers anticipated that they would feel disappointed or frustrating at some point during the trip. Only 5%. But during the trip, 61% of people reported feeling disappointed or frustrated or tired. And then after the trip, only 11% of the people remembered feeling disappointed or frustrated. And what's crazy is there was a really close association between people who expected to be disappointed and people who remembered being disappointed. And people who expected to have fun remembered having fun, even though they all experienced some disappointment or frustration during a 3-week trip too. So again, the expectations going into the experience ended up shaping the memory of the experience. You do the same thing when you go on vacation. Researchers have done lots of studies on people on vacation, and there was one study that tracked 46 people before, during, and after they took a trip. They basically were asked, how positive or negative are you feeling? They were asked if they could indicate, a scale of 1 to 5, their agreement with statements like, I expect to enjoy spring break, or I'll be satisfied with this vacation. And the researchers found the same thing. As with the bike trip, people enjoyed their vacations less than they predicted and less than they remembered. The biggest predictor of whether they would repeat their vacation was their remembered experience, and the second biggest predictor was their predicted experience, and the third biggest predictor was their actual experience. What both of these studies indicated is that while your memory is largely determined by peaks and ends, sometimes the peaks and ends get completely overruled by the predictions you may have going into an experience. So those are 4 exceptions to the peak end rule. There could be more that emerge with more research as psychologists are looking at this more and more. But the bottom line is generally a peak end rule works, but there are exceptions, and those exceptions are kind of within categories of knowing the goals, knowing how the events are going to go and the expectations you have going into them. And the reason in general is that because you have these assumptions about your experience before you've started them, your brain has fewer question marks going into them. So it's less likely to find those peaks and ends and integrate them together to create a memory of that experience. Okay, we've talked a lot about the peak and the end and how they work and how your memory works and when it doesn't work the way it should. We're going to close with a little bit of a more philosophical question, and this has to do with the self. We've been talking about 2 selves, an experiencing self and a remembering self. We've seen that the peak end rule reveals that your experienced feelings don't match your remembered feelings. So your experiencing self and your remembering self see the world in different ways, and sometimes very opposite ways. These differences are not small. Think about it. One likes long colonoscopies, the other likes them short. One prefers a short childbirth, the other wants them long. One likes watching short advertisements, the other likes them longer. So very different views of the world, your experiencing self and your remembering self. So though you have an experiencing self and the remembering self, your 2 selves are still you. Okay? The long colonoscopy preferring version of you and the short colonoscopy preferring version of you are the same person. They're both you. So the question here, and I'm borrowing this question from Daniel Kahneman, who I've referenced before. He did a TED Talk on this. You can find it if you want to search for it. The question here is, who is in charge? Which self is really you? Who's calling the shots? Is it the remembering self or the experiencing self? So I'm going to answer this with an illustration. Pretend, again, you're about to go on vacation. But here's the catch. You can't take pictures. That's not all. You're not going to remember a single thing from your vacation. So the moment you return home and step off the plane, let's pretend somebody holds a device to your head and it wipes your memory and you won't even know you went on vacation. So the question is, would you still go? What this gets at is that, do you go on vacation to experience it, or do you go on vacation to remember it? Are you going on vacation to be there, or are you going on vacation to make memories of being on vacation? Well, your experiencing self would go again. Experiencing you would go on that vacation again. It's It's your remembering self right now who's not so sure. A few years ago, I did this very thing myself without the memory wiping guy at the end. I spent a few weeks traveling the Middle East without a camera. And why? Because I didn't want my desire to take pictures to impede my ability to enjoy what I was seeing and doing. Basically, I didn't want my remembering self to ruin the moment my experiencing self was having. When I tell people this, they're a little bit incredulous that I don't really have any documentation of my trip. I don't have a single picture, and it's true. I probably would have a better memory of that trip had I taken pictures, but in the big picture, I don't really regret it. Partially is because all the places I visited have been documented by photographers who are, more skilled than me. So bottom line here, you go on vacation to make memories. The reason for your trips aren't the experiences you have, but the memories you'll make. Doesn't mean your experiences don't matter, but it's just not the reason you go on vacation or have any experience, really. In cases like this, it's your experiencing self that is subordinate to your remembering self. Okay, but what about negative experiences? So pretend that instead of going on vacation, you're about to undergo a painful medical procedure. Would you rather your experiencing self feel more pain so that your remembering self feels less pain? If you're a doctor, should you prolong your patient's pain as long as it's a little bit less at the end so that their memory of the overall experience of pain will be less later? Do you want their experiencing self to have more pain so their remembering self has less? What about prison sentences? Should we demand lengthy prison sentences for really heinous crimes when a short prison sentence with the same peaks and end will produce the same memory of the punishment in the long run? Or how about this? Should teachers encourage students to quit studying while they're ahead so that students' remembering selves view the study session more positively and are more likely to study again, even if their grades take a short-term hit? So these are good questions. To answer them, let's return to a claim that I made at the very beginning of this video. I showed you that what you experience as the present lasts roughly 3 seconds. That's now. And you will never experience that moment again, and your memory of it will degrade to zero almost immediately, and all you will have are feelings, and most of those are going to be gone too. That's the difference between the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self, while being the life you're living right now, disappears. It's the remembering self, in the words of Daniel Kahneman, Jason Reese, they wrote this great article. They said that it's the remembering self that is relatively stable and permanent. The only perspective that we can adopt as we think about our lives is therefore that of the remembering self. So that's something to chew on. Who you are isn't just who you are right now. It's also this crudely calculated moving average of feelings you've had during your most important moments, combined with your best attempts at salvaging what you can from the world as you experience it. All right, that's the end of this video. If you like it, hit subscribe. Check out the citations for this below. You can also read a little bit more about this on my website at kenthendricks.com. Thanks for joining me today.